We're very fortunate this morning and very blessed to have a Christian author and Merle Temple to come and share with us this morning. I've been very excited about the opportunity to have him here. If you've not read his books, you need to do so. They're very thrilling, very eye-opening. They'll touch your heart and life. I promise you they will. And we want to give him all the time that he needs this morning. So, Merle, come on up and share what God's laid on your heart, brother. God bless you now.
Thank you. Well, it's kind of tough to follow Lee after that. That was a beautiful rendition of that song. And for those of you who hadn't read my books and don't know, in book 2 called A Rented World, those are the last words that Michael Parker speaks as he's walking up the hill to prison. For those of y'all who don't know my story, it was an unexpected detour, but it was there in prison that God turned off the noise of the world for me so I could hear him. And like C.S. Lewis said, he shouted at me through that megaphone of pain and said, "Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?" It was there that I learned to let my will yield to his will. I, the very independent person, learned that to surrender is actually to win, and to die to self is actually to live eternally. And so many lessons learned there. And it was there also where I learned to stop begging God for deliverance and only to show me his threads of good and purpose woven into crushing blankets of pain so that I might understand and become a better servant of Jesus Christ. I grew up in the South in the 50s and 60s over in Mississippi. In those days, it seemed as though the good guys always won, and they wore white hats, and or so it seemed in the books and movies anyway, and in my naivete. But we all hunted and fished in the old days in the South, and I was the one they always sent outside to turn the little metal TV antenna where they would say, "No, a little to the right. No, a little to the left. That's it. Don't move." That was me, and we grew up dreaming, performing chivalrous deeds and being the hero in all the stories and rescuing the damsel in distress. And, and then when I left high school and went to Washington for a while to work for the FBI, met J. Edgar Hoover and a lot of interesting people up there, decided I better come home finally and go to college and at Ole Miss. And I did, and I married my first wife, Susan, who, ironically enough, was best friends with my current wife, Judy. And so just as I was leaving Ole Miss, President Nixon declared the first war on drugs in the early 70s. And I was graduating with a degree in criminal justice, and I said, well, that must be the place for me. So I left and went into that first as an undercover agent, then an investigator, and eventually the first captain in the agency. And while I was working undercover, there weren't many of us. If you got in trouble, no one was coming to rescue you because there just wasn't anyone. And so I was held hostage down in South Mississippi late one night by guys who, if you read the books, you'll see it fictionalized, where they actually chewed up and ate double-edged Gillette razor blades, swallowed them, and then swallowed fire to cauterize the wounds. They had serious issues, and I won't go into all of that happened, but next year after that, I was an investigator up near Memphis, and we hit an organized crime stronghold just south of Memphis, much like the original Walking Tall movie, if y'all ever saw that. And in fact, some of the people out of McNairy County, Tennessee, who were depicted in that movie were actually in this new syndicate there, who had moved in and paid off a lot of local officials. And we hit them one night, unbeknownst to anyone, and they didn't take kindly to it, and they issued a contract to have me killed, and I was lured out by 2 contract killers hired by the Dixie Mafia to kill me just south of Memphis under the pretext of giving me information. And so I'll leave the rest of that story. But in 1976, when I was captain over the north half of the state, We were doing a heroin deal. We were doing a buy bust. They'd bought heroin from the dealers before. We were going to do a large amount to draw out everybody behind them, and we had this deal set up on a day that turned out to be one of the coldest days in November, and an ice storm like I'd never seen hit the state and just made everything from Jackson to Corinth just at one big sheet of ice late that night. And it was so dark that day, it looks like it was squeezing all the light out of the world. And as I was leaving my office to run down to the car to go meet the agents and set up the parameters of the deal, I put my hand on a gear shift, and just as I did, the Spirit filled up my car, wrapped all around me, all through me, all in me, and said, "Go back and get the bulletproof vest." And then it was gone. It terrified me because I wasn't walking with God then. I was a very nominal Christian. I'd been raised in the church, but just didn't understand the personal relationship with Christ at all. And I thought, well, I'm losing my mind. I have no reason to believe we need them. And I didn't like to wear them. We were bulky, even though it was cold and hard to conceal. And they would only stop up to a .38 caliber handgun. That was all we had in those days. So I put my hand on the gear shift again to leave. The Spirit came in and filled up the car, wrapped all around me and through me, and it wasn't optional. Go back and get the vest. I did. I said, okay, out loud, and not sure what was going on. I always knew I had the favor of God all my life, but I didn't understand it, and I ran from it. I was sure that he was just really busy, helping people who really needed him, and I would just take care of business, and long story short, we got there. I got the agents to wear the vest, and a deal got away from us, and within hours, a few hours later, we were out on this high road out in the middle of nowhere, high embankment with depressions on either side and a big railroad trestle that ran across. And there, we didn't know they were planted on the railroad trestle behind a clump of pine trees. They had a sniper there with a high-powered rifle. And when the agents began to do the deal, and we were off on surveillance surrounding them as close as we could get, as they went to do the deal, the sniper just opened fire and rained down high-powered rifle fire on the agents, and we came across in the crossfire. It was a nightmare. It was a terrible gun battle and gun smoke wafting across the hillside, and we had wounded one of them. They had wounded us, and a female agent radioed me, told me she was taking the wounded agent to the hospital, and later a long story, but when we secured the scene and the sniper had fled and I told everybody to quit shooting at shadows, I went to the hospital and I tried to comfort the young agent there, the female, and arrested the violator she had wounded. And I walked into the ER, and there they were cutting the clothes off my friend and one of the agents who worked in our team and who had been severely wounded, and there was the vest that the Spirit had commanded me to go back and get, and it was white normally, but it was crimson soaked in blood. And they were taking it off, and just as I walked up, the ER doctor said, "Merle, look at this." He said he was hit in the lower extremities. He was sliced through his arm with a high-powered rifle, and this one hit him in the chest, and it penetrated the vest because it wasn't designed to stop a high-powered rifle. But when it punched through, it took some of the punch out of it and deflected it, so it went in behind his right breast and skittered around the barrel of his rib cage and popped out behind his left breast. He said, "Merle, if he hadn't had that vest on, it would have taken out his heart and lungs. He would have been dead before he hit the ground." I get chill bumps right now down to my toes, just like I did 40 years ago, because you could just hear the shuffle of angels' feet, all around us there, and I knew that we were not alone, and I was not alone. And you would think that I would get it after all of that. I'd been through, but I didn't. I kind of doubled down on my works-based salvation plan, which is really no plan at all. And I thought if I was just as good as I could be, maybe one day it would all weigh out, and the doors of heaven would swing wide open, and they'd say, "Come on in." Of course, it doesn't work that way. And shortly thereafter, I investigated a corrupt governor who was trying to infiltrate our agency with folks to spy on us, and it didn't come out the way they hoped. So they were very upset, and things happened that made it untenable for me to stay. And because people in government and power use that power to squelch or destroy anyone who gets in their way. And often we don't understand that in the outside when we just read the headline and don't know the story beneath it. So I decided I had to leave, and about that time, the Bell system came along and offered me a job as a security manager to go into their corporate world and to investigate crime and corruption in the corporate world. And I did, and when I got there, I found that, the more things change, the more they stay the same, and it's kind of like the frying pan into the fire. And I also began to try to volunteer in political campaigns, always searching for someone, a flag, a champion to follow. And I became Ronald Reagan State Criminal Justice Chairman in 1980. But there in that corporate and political world, I began to see, there was this unholy trinity of politics, crime, and business. And eventually, I was to find out that the organized crime figures who tried to kill me were nothing compared to some of the political criminals that I would encounter later in my life. I began to migrate across the company in many different jobs for Bell, and first to Birmingham and then to Georgia. I came to Augusta to be the district manager here and spokesman for the company. And one reason I came here was because my first wife, Susan, had severe health problems. She had many side effects from her type 1 diabetes she'd had since she was 11. So we came here because we heard about all the great hospitals here and the great health care, and we were validated in that decision because they saved Susan's life more than once in many long and torturous surgeries and long stays in ICU and so on. So we were very blessed by that. But the old fixer, I've been the fixer ever since I was a kid. Everybody always looked at me and friends and family to fix everything and make everything right. But I couldn't fix that of Susan's. We could only stall it and prolong it. Poured myself into my work here, and on the face of it, people thought, wow, it seemed ideal. I was chairman of this board and president of that fund drive, and became very well known here in the Augusta area. And it was the corporate jet out of Atlanta would stop through here sometimes and pick me up and fly me to Washington for evening dinners, with politicos up there. And it was it might have seemed really, really nice in a temporal sense, but it all left me empty and hollow. It wasn't filling up that big old hole in my heart. And I hadn't yet learned what C.S. Lewis also said, and that was about if you find that nothing in this world can seem to satisfy that desire, that nags you, he said, perhaps it's because you were made for another world. And but I didn't know that. The awards from man piled up, mostly in my closet, and I thought, well, if I just got one more award, one more recognition, then I'd be worthy somehow. And but it never worked. Like an addict seeking the next fix and the next fix, it was less and less satisfying, and pretty soon I wasn't even going to the award ceremonies. I was off down the road trying to get another fix, and trying to push through that wall of complexity that I viewed in life. If I strained and tried hard enough and was good enough, I could break through, and there on the far side of complexity, I would find that elusive peace and that true truth that I was seeking, not knowing all along that it was Jesus Christ right there with me, every day and protecting me. Many things happened. We were here in Augusta. One day, our congressman called me. I was close to him and had supported him, and he called and he told me that, well, he said, we have a ethically challenged incumbent legislator here, and we're going to back a challenger against him, and I would like you to secretly chair her campaign and to raise money for her, because the word had gotten out that I was proficient at raising funds, and so I agreed, knowing that there would be consequences. I knew it wouldn't be easy because I knew who backed the incumbent, and so we did that, and of course it leaked out. You can't go out and tell people you're supporting so-and-so and please give me a donation without that leaking out, and of course it did. And then one night the incumbent called me at my house to scream at me and to tell me that he said, I'm going to break up her marriage, I'm going to break up her family, I'm going to ruin her, I'm going to run her out of the state of Georgia. Do you hear me, Merle? I'm going to destroy her. And then another friendly call came in from his ally at the local paper here, and he said, what are you doing? You've got to stop and cease this, and we don't want you involved. And he said, the reputation you have here in the community, we played a large part in that. We made you, and we can break you. But I didn't withdraw. I doubled down times 10. And in the end, the challenger beat the incumbent by a wide margin, and some call it the greatest political upset in Georgia in 50 years. But the joy and the celebration was short-lived, as I knew it would be. Some local political figures here called my superiors in Atlanta and told them that no political legislation for Bell will move until you punish him, until you silence him and mute him and just take him out. So I was summoned to Atlanta by the people who had named me their top manager in that department for 12 straight years. I was summoned there, and it was very harsh and very brutal. And the high-ranking officials looked at me in that room, it just filled with sadness and sorrow and things I can't describe. And they said, who do you think you are? No one cares about these little crusades of yours. Right and wrong don't matter. There's only the here and now. You're going to stop all of this. You're never going to have another thought in your life. You're never going to utter another opinion. You're going to go back to Augusta, to East Georgia, and you're going to be a good boy, and you're going to make money for us like you always have. I was brokenhearted to be treated that way by the company I loved, and I couldn't accept it. I asked for early retirement and a buyout of my pension, and they granted it. They were stunned, but they granted it. So then the congressman tried to rescue me, and with an appointment as U.S. Marshal for the Southern District in the new Bush administration, things would have been good because Senator Coverdale, who I was very close to, and I was his Georgia drug-free chairman in East Georgia, he would have had sole appointing authority for the new administration as the only senator of his party at that time. But Paul had passed away suddenly from an aneurysm, and so it fell into infighting amongst the congressmen. And some of them really weren't too keen on having a guy who had just defeated an incumbent, for after all, they were incumbents. And so after a while, we saw that no amount of trips to Washington and meetings were going to rescue that, and so we finally withdrew it, and into that void stepped the Georgia Superintendent of Education. And I had been her East Georgia business chairman. I always loved to help people who were underdogs, and she was certainly the underdog in Atlanta, being really the only Republican there in a sea of a city that had been under one-party rule for 100 years. and she was a woman. And that was no easy thing in Atlanta in those days, believe me. So she offered me a job as one of her 4 deputy superintendents. She had a vacancy. And so, I should have refused it. I should have stayed home and just taken a long sabbatical and enjoyed my time, whatever time we had left with Susan, who she was so critically ill. But I didn't. I wanted one more great battle, more dragons to slay, and I was going to show them, whoever it was I wanted to show, and so Susan and I moved to Atlanta and got an apartment, and I accepted that job, and I found that it was just so much worse than even I had imagined there. It was brutal, a toxic environment, and so many wars of using proxies to go after this person and that person, and the governor and the superintendent would at each other all the time because he thought she would run against him and she wouldn't do what he wanted her to do, and he supported the State Board of Education, and that group then was very partisan and brutal to poor career employees who had to testify before them, but they would hammer them to try it again as proxies to try to hurt the superintendent. And I used to see employees before and after the board meetings, they would be throwing up in the bathroom, breaking out in hives and just shaking all over because they were terrified to go before that board. It's just as bad as I can tell you. It was just very little humanity to be found there. And, it was in the midst of all that, then the governor decided he wanted to build kind of a shadow government, an extra legal government, we called it, and that, wasn't supported by the Constitution, and actually to undermine some of the constitutional officers elected by the people of Georgia. And so that began, and then the informants, it was like I was back in the law enforcement days, informants in other agencies began to call me and tell me what they were planning to do, and they were morphing this agency into that and this, and things that was never intended to be, and bypassing the legislature, and trying to circumvent the constitutional state debt limit, and finding friendly judges. And it was just... it was a movie, like some of the movies you've seen out of Washington, except real. And then the governor decided he needed money to fund all of that, and so he began to eye the nearly $1 billion in federal education money we had coming in from Washington, and he asked us for some of that money just to give it to him, and we said, no, we can't do that, it's illegal. And so they sent emissaries to Washington and the U.S. Department of Education, to ask them, can't we just take this money and do what we want to with it? And they were horrified and said no. And then the Assistant U.S. Secretary of Education called me from Washington one day, and she said, look, we know what's going on down there. And said, you hold the line. Merle, you hold the line. We'll prosecute anybody who diverts any of this money. Hold the line, hold the line. And then she came to Atlanta in the presence of the U.S. Secretary, Raj Page himself, and reiterated that charge, hold the line. We're behind you, hold the line. And then the call came from a friendly source in the White House. And they told us, y'all have been thrown under the bus. They've cut a deal with the Georgia governor to be the only governor of his party to endorse No Child Left Behind. A terrible bill, in my opinion. I don't think you'd find many teachers who would disagree with me. And so then we saw the handwriting on the wall. And then the infamous conference call came in from Washington that I was totally unexpecting. And they called and said, Mr. So-and-so, we're bridging you on to the conference call. And I'm like, what conference call? And it was all these politicos from all over Washington, the White House, U.S. Ed, who knows where all they were from. And it was all of them shooting at me, that day, and they said, "We've called to tell you that there's been a change, and the Assistant U.S. Secretary and the Secretary himself are no longer available to you. And we, whoever they were, we have decided that we're going to allow the diversion of that money and defer considerations of prosecution until a later date," a date which, of course, would never come. It was a straight-up political deal outside the framework of law. And they said, and furthermore, to make it easier to be diverted, we're going to cease sending that money to the Georgia Department of Education. We're going to send it to the State Board of Education. And it was madness. It had never been done. It was totally illegal and outside the Constitution. And like I said, the board is just a part-time group of people, you know, who had no means to receive or disperse money and no staff to speak of. And it was just madness. It was like Wells Fargo calling the local bank and saying, "Look, there are bank robbers in town, so to hold down trouble, our armored cars is going to deliver the money right to the bank robbers." And so then after that, we looked for ways to move against that. And under law, the Georgia Department could take 5% off the top for cost of all money coming in. And that had not been done to hold down cost and push out every dollar we could to local schools. So the superintendent claimed that to keep it away from the board, and started sending out money for test bed projects and to fund things all over the state. And the board was furious, but there wasn't much they could do about it because that was clearly within her authority. And during the midst of all of that, too, there were leaks out of the department. We were scanning we were having Bell come in. I was calling our friends at Bell to scan our lines for wiretaps. There were moles inside the agency. And we were being hammered in the press and by all the surrogates of the other side, everywhere we went. And in the midst of all that, we even had to escort one of the deputies out of the building, fire him and escort him from the building because he had gone over to the other side. And in the midst of that, a retired state trooper called and had a meeting with us to say, "Do you know how much danger y'all are in? The word has gone out to some people, not all people, and most would ignore it, but the word has gone out even in some trooper huts that if y'all are y'all are to be found out on the road campaigning or whatever, stop you and harass you, arrest you, whatever they might do." And it's hard to imagine. You think, well, that couldn't happen, but unfortunately those things do happen. And so in that moment of paranoia and the siege mentality took over, and the inner circle shrank and shrank and shrank, and it was like we were in the Alamo, you know, surrounded on all sides by Santa Ana. And in the context of that, you know, the superintendent and I just became way too close, much too close, and our relationship just became inappropriate. And but to follow that, a vendor showed up, and a vendor said he had great products for the state schools for the blind and deaf, and those kids never really got anything. They were on the low end of the totem pole in Atlanta, and the board hardly ever did anything extra for them. They were an afterthought. So the superintendent decided she wanted to do something to help them, and at the same time help herself, because the vendor had broadly hinted that he would support her campaign for governor because she had decided to go for broke and run for governor. And so it was that moment, when things that are firmly in the no category in your life move over a little bit into the maybe. And when you decide, well, I'm going to defeat who I think are the bad guys, you become a little bit like them. You kind of step across that line and you get on that slippery slope. And those deals are made a lot, but you know that you have stepped out on that ice and you hear it cracking underneath you, like you do in growing up on the pond in the winter when it's frozen. You step out and you hear that sickening crack sound. So we did that, and later, as things came to pass, they would say that, those funds had been diverted from blind and deaf kids. But that was totally not true. It made for a good headline, but it was totally not true. They had never gotten anything and wouldn't have gotten anything if the superintendent had not signed the contracts with the vendor to send that to them. And it never got to them anyway because the state board stepped in and voided the contracts that she had signed partly because despite crocodile tears, they wanted every penny they could to go to their patron downtown. So that's kind of how that works. And so the superintendent lost her bid for governor. It was the longest of long shots, but she missed the runoff in the primary about 1%. But she lost, and we all went home. And then one dark night, the FBI showed up at my house, and the tables were turned on the old law enforcement officer, and they told me that, ironically, we had been indicted for a diversion of federal funds. And, it was just as bad as I can tell you. I can't tell you how bad it was that night. Unthinkable. Unthinkable, and how in the world did I ever get here? The person that most people would call the last of the Boy Scouts. How in the world did I ever get here? And it began to dawn on me what I had put at risk. And for what? For this temporal moment, this temporal battle in a temporal world already fading away, even as it is here today when you and I are here to talk and to worship Christ. And I knew that I had put at risk my position as Susan's caregiver that I had been for over 30 years, and that she needed me now worse than ever, and I put that at risk. It's one of those moments where when you pass a mirror and you stop and look at yourself and you say, who are you? I don't know you, and I don't like you, and what have you done? What have you done? And then you just fall down in the bathroom and you just retch and retch and retch until there's nothing left but blood. And that belly full of rats is just gnawing at your insides and it won't let you go. And I tried to minimize it as best I could as I looked at the federal conviction rate, and I knew that virtually no one in the modern era now wins against the feds. Their conviction rate is 96 to 98%. And they have many laws, and it's harsh too when you go to court and try to win in court. So I decided to plea and try to minimize it as best I could. And the superintendent told me, well, she wasn't, because we hadn't done anything wrong, that we were the good guys. And I said, well, they have the laws. And so I pled, and I agreed not to have contact with her as part of my plea agreement. And the prosecutor and I just never liked each other. There were brutal sessions we had when I was supposed to be their witness. And I felt like they were asking me to remember things that maybe didn't happen. And one night I lost my temper and I lost my mind. And I contacted the superintendent to tell her that I would be an honest witness on the stand, and by law I was everyone's witness on the stand, and I would tell the truth about all that happened with Washington and the diversion of the money and all that kind of stuff. Well, I didn't know then that she was taping me. There was some bitterness there, I think, and she taped me in the morning I was going up to prepare to testify. I didn't know she had gotten up there early and she had pled guilty. And as she was leaving the room, they told me she turned, reached in her purse, and got the tape and said, you might want this, and tossed it to the agents. It was nothing to benefit. And when I arrived, they were upset, and the prosecutor was screaming at me again, and they arrested me without warrant for obstruction of justice. And they shackled me, and the marshals dragged me off to the Atlanta Correctional Facility where I couldn't testify in the vendor trial. And they changed the whole truth. The truth that we had agreed upon over here, where I was going to testify to, and other witnesses mostly corroborated, they changed that whole truth and moved it over here then to paint me as the central figure and use the superintendent to testify against me. And so there I was in Atlanta facility in solitary where they'd put me because the case was so high profile. They afraid the guys in there might kill me. And I had become addicted to Xanax in the midst of all that stress that my doctor had given me, and really had ignored how dangerous Xanax withdrawal could be until they made me go cold turkey in there. And people got word out to my wife that they thought I was about to die, and she raised the roof, and people came down. They found me incoherent and unresponsive, and they took me out in the middle of the night to the hospital. And the officers who took me to the hospital downtown that night, down the back streets of Atlanta in the middle of the night, they began to tell me they thought they would just kill me and dump my body in the Chattahoochee. And I wanted to believe they were just being cruel, but in that situation where you're shackled and helpless in the back streets of Atlanta at midnight, you're really not so sure. And finally, after recovering in a ward for a couple of weeks, they brought me back to the same place. But when we did, praise God, somebody brought me a Bible. And it was there that God broke me in that cell. And down on my knees, I surrendered, and I was truly born again. Amen. And immediately, men in there, hardened men who had never seen me, they knew I was there, began to flock to my door. And they came to that big metal door where I wasn't allowed out. And they would sit on the floor and look through that little slot and stare at me and began to confess crimes to me, heinous crimes, murder, everything that you can imagine. And I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what they sought from me. I felt so inadequate. And I asked God, Lord, what is this? And he showed me, that in your works-based salvation and trying to be a good guy, you were extending that helping hand to people to pull them up. But you're brought down now into a world where you would have never known before, so that you can know and understand Christ and his coming down to suffer for the world and die for the world. And so many good things happened there, and then I decided to try for second bail, which no one thought I could get after all that had happened, because I knew I wasn't getting any good deal anymore, probably no time, or very little time, or probably probation. That was gone with the wind. And but I went to the hearing, and despite the best efforts of the prosecutor, the judge wasn't buying any of it, and he ordered them to let me go home and get my affairs in order and provide for Susan's care and everything. And then a screaming match broke out, and the prosecutor jumped up, started telling the federal judge what he couldn't do. And believe me, that's just not really something you want to do in a federal court, is to tell a federal judge what he can't do. And he threatened you had to gavel up to hit him with contempt and so forth. And but I went home, and after I got home, Susan had heart attacks and stuff, and she had another stroke, and it was just a sorrowful time. And when I left her that day, we left her with nurses and friends at the house, and she was in her wheelchair. That was truly the hardest day of my life. And then I went up to prison, surrendered at Edgefield. A friend took me, and I went in as we were being processed and strip searched once again, one of those many indignities that you go through time and time again. I was going up the hill, and 535 men were waiting to see me because they had heard about the case, and it was local papers and news to them in Edgefield, and they had seen the superintendent on WRDW in a serialized interviews, claiming victim status and telling her side of the story. And they decided, well, they were just going to make life really hard on me, and some of the staff did too. But the Christians came to me, the Christians on the inside, some of the truest and best Christians, not just professing but confessing Christians, came, took me under their wings, and showed me that I was not alone, and showed me how to be as safe as I could be there. And so that journey of 2,000 nights inside began. And Susan would come to see me when she could. The nurses would bring her, and then one day I got the call that she had died. They told me at home with her nurse, without me where I should have been, that she woke up one morning, looked up and said, "Mama, Mama, is that you?" And then she was gone. And when they got the word to me, that was the next hardest day in my life. And my lawyer said he applied for me to go to Susan's funeral, only 30 minutes away. And but they said, no, we don't have an officer to escort him, and we were offered to pay for off-duty, and they said no. And the federal judge in Atlanta issued an order ordering the Bureau of Prisons to take me to that funeral 30 minutes away. And in a very unusual move, they defied a federal judge and appealed it to the appeals court, knowing it would just run out the clock on me. There was no time for an appeal. It was only like 2 or 3 days to her funeral. But out of that sadness, there were opportunities, because it gave me standing to witness to other men who were suffering and couldn't go to funerals, and to talk about God to them and what he had done for me. And then the Lord showed me he wanted me to start a prison ministry on the inside, and everybody said, oh, that can't happen. An inmate, you're nothing but an inmate. And but we did. We with the help of friends and the Lord, we began to get movies in, and we started a Christian movie night. And men came. We started showing those movies every week, and it was a highlight of their days to come. They knew TV and they knew movies, and they wouldn't darken the door of a church, but they came to our Christian movies. And there in the dark, packed out, with standing room only, I'd hear these big, tough men begin to weep. And their hearts opened and softened to the approach of the Holy Spirit, and men were accepting Christ. And we'd go on to do those at all 3 facilities where I was, and we believe it was the most successful inmate-led ministry ever in the Bureau of Prisons. Thousands of men exposed to the gospel of Christ, and that one day that a man who had resisted, it finally came to one of the movies, and because he was surrounded by trouble, and he said, just leave me alone, Merle, and leave me alone. And he finally said, okay, I'll come if you'll shut up, if you'll leave me alone. And that night, it was another great night. Men were crying. I walked back up the hill, and I was in my room by myself, sitting on my bunk praying, and I said, Lord, thank you for tonight. But Lord, why am I still here? Why am I still here? And at that very moment, I could hear a clearing of the throat, and I looked up at my doorway, and there was that man that I had hounded to come. And he said, am I interrupting, Merle? I said, oh, no. And he said, oh, Merle, he said, I thought there was no way out of my troubles. He said, but tonight, there in that chapel, listening to the words of Christ, he said, I knew exactly what he wanted me to do. He said, thank you. Thank you for staying after me. And when he walked off, I looked up and I said, thank you, Lord, because I knew that was my answer. And as I continued to deal with the loss of Susan, one day I was kind of wallowing in my bed of pity, and laying there with my headphones on and little hit earpieces, or if we held our nose right and the wind was just right, we could get a Christian station, distant broadcast. And I was laying there wallowing in my pity, and nothing but static in my ears, and all of a sudden it just went crystal clear. Transmission broke out of that static, and a voice I had never heard, and I never heard again, said, you there, and it was so direct. I half sat up and opened my eyes. He said, yes, I'm talking to you. It's not noble what you're doing, lying there in your bed of pity. Now you get up and you get about your Father's business. And I did. And as I said, the ministry went on. There's so many stories I could tell you, and I'm writing book 3 now. I promised God I'd write 3 books inside. Fictionally telling my story, inspired by that, and his story of redemption and salvation. And I would go out all across the country to show people my redeemed life, that they might want to meet my Redeemer. And Judy and I have been here, there, and everywhere, and even went out to Hollywood. They called us out there. I want to tell you, there's no shortage of people to witness to out there. But God's hand is in all of it, opening doors that everybody told us could never be opened. Schools picking up my first book to teach in middle and high schools, and one college making it required reading, and Adrian Rogers' old church in Memphis, Bellevue, has both of them in their library, and they stay checked out. They're favorites there. And had a private meeting with Ravi Zacharias, the great Christian apologist who I learned so much from in Atlanta. And God is just all out, and I'm just so grateful He can use somebody as pitiful as I am to be His instrument. And thankful He gave me a second chance, and we serve a God of second chances. And so I will tell you, as I tell everybody, when you look at people in prison or in any kind of hardship, or you hear something about them and you think they're this person or that person, there are all kind of prisons of the heart and mind, and there are a lot of people on the outside who are in those prisons, and all of those people are deserving of our love and our forgiveness. And I said we have a bad habit of wanting to freeze people, who we think they were yesterday or 5 years ago. And I always tell them, aren't you glad God didn't do that to us before He sent His Son to die for us on the cross? And sometimes when I'm attacked by non-believers, I tell them, well, I hear no love from you, but I love you because He loved me when I thought I was alone and unlovable. Jesus walks out here on Washington Road. He walks along my road to prison. He walked among the rows of the prison beds. The Messianic government in Washington can't stop Him, and prison bars couldn't keep Him out. And like the old hymn says, He got the whole world in His hands. And I ask people, whose image is on you? He owns everything. And so just so thankful and blessed to be here today, and that God gives us these opportunities. And you'll just never know how much it meant to me that y'all let me come here and tell you my story today, because among men, I count myself as most blessed. I got nothing that I once asked for, but everything I could have hoped for. And thank you, and God bless you.